to the Strangeology Podcast, your place for exploring the world of weird and high strangeness. I'm your host, Jeff, and I like to cover all sorts of topics from cryptids and conspiracies to UFOs and the paranormal, forbidden knowledge, mysterious history, and all things unknown. Well, all right. Sorry for the delay, everyone. That seems to be happening a little bit too much lately with this show this year, but we're trying to stay on track with that bi-weekly release as best we can. Sometimes things just get real busy over here, and I've just had a lot of things going on for the past couple of weeks. The summer's winding down, we're getting ready for winter and all that fun stuff, but I hope you're all doing well out there and that you've had a great summer. I'm definitely ready for fall, though, because it's been super hot for the past several weeks, and we have like one little final wave of heat for this week. But but we're going into my favorite time of year, of course. So it's never too early to start with the Halloween decorations and finding some new stuff to grab for the season and just getting spooky with it, you know? As far as updates go, I'm recording this before heading out on a little vacation, a little weekender, long weekend with the family. Much needed, of course. It's been quite a while since we've had a little bit of break, and so it's going to be fun. I mentioned the last episode that I was going to be announcing a new merch design, which turned out to be, if you follow me over on social media, you already know this, but if you don't, it was a Flatwoods Monster design. And that one was a long time coming. It's in a similar style to the kind of comic pop art style of cryptid encounter events that I've been making, like the Mothman Harbinger of Doom design, the Fresno Nightcrawler design I have. I've also got the Hopkinsville Goblins and Jersey Devil and Van Meter Visitor. So stoked to have the Flatwoods Monster added to that collection, and people like immediately started picking them up. I was kind of surprised, so that was really awesome. If you're listening, thank you for being some of the early adopters of that design. I'm hoping to expand that line a little more before the end of the year, but we'll see how that goes. And of course, I hosted a merch giveaway as a thank you for the recent 30,000 downloads milestone that I passed, which featured the Flatwoods Monster design merch. I gave away a sticker, a mug, and a t-shirt as well. So congrats again to all the winners out there. And, you know, a reminder, if you don't follow me over on Instagram especially, you'll want to do that so you get to find out first when I'm hosting merch giveaways for my merch. And I'm on other, big platforms too, but like TikTok, but I haven't really done a giveaway there yet. And I also forget to post all the same stuff in every place that I post things. So definitely follow me on Instagram. And as far as upcoming events go, I'm going to be vending at the Sasquatch Calling Festival in Whitehall, New York on Saturday, September 24th. So if you're in the area, stop by, say hi, maybe pick up a t-shirt or a sticker. That would be much appreciated. And at the end of the day, there's going to be a literal Sasquatch calling contest, which I'm really excited to see. So definitely, if you're in the area, come out, hang out. There's going to be a lot of vendors, a lot of cool stuff going on, all about Bigfoot. And speaking of cryptids, I've got some local cryptid news for the first time, which is kind of weird. So this piece of news, local to my state, is about catamounts, otherwise known as cougars or mountain lions. Eastern cougar, I think, is what it's officially referred to. And these big cats, obviously they're not as big as like a tiger or a lion, but they're pretty big and they can mess you up. They have been officially extinct in the state of Vermont since 1881. But people over the last couple decades have occasionally reported seeing a big mountain lion catamount like cat. And there's some like sport teams. I think the like University of Vermont is the Catamounts. So it's kind of like, an ingrained thing in the culture here. And, it's when people see them, they're like, that's not an oversized house cat or a dog or even other like larger wild cats that we have here, like bobcats or lynx. They're pretty distinctive in their look. So I would think it would be hard to have it be a case of mistaken identity. So, they still exist elsewhere in the country, of course. But as far as in like Vermont and the Northeast, they might as well be cryptids because supposedly they don't exist here these days. So anyway, the story goes is that I'm grilling dinner for my family and I'm checking my email real quick to see what's going on, and the local town message board notification email that I get daily comes through, and it's like a bulletin board that people can post things like, oh, I'm missing a dog or my cat, or hey, I do this odd job if anyone has work for me, or I'm selling stuff, or wanting recommendations for like, I just moved to the area, what's a good restaurant to eat at, that kind of thing. It's like a local Craigslist. So the very first message says something like, mountain lion spotted walking near the main road near local hair salon. And I'm like, what? So I'm reading through this, and this local person describes it as this feline creature, this animal that's around 2 feet tall at the shoulder. It has like a 2 foot or longer tail. It has this tawny brown coat and just all the hallmarks of a catamount. And this is like less than 2 miles from where I live. So now I'm on mountain lion alert. So that's pretty interesting. I live in a place that, has it's a small town, but there's, several thousand people that live in this town, and there's commerce and busy roads and all that stuff. So there is some wilderness pretty close by, some state forests. So if one of these things wandered down from like Quebec up in Canada or something like that, there could be a small population, or it's just like a random individual. And there's word on the street that they might be making a comeback to the Northeast. So if you're a hiker out there in New England or anything like that, definitely watch out, because there could be a mountain lion stalking you. And I mean, I've seen big cat tracks out in the woods in the past few years. Although I can't say I'm experienced enough with tracking to say whether or not it was a cougar versus a bobcat or a lynx or anything like that. But it's a pretty interesting tale that I wanted to just relay to you all there. I'm probably a little too excited about it, honestly. But anyway, that's enough of my rambling. Let's get into today's episode. Now, this one is about the conspiracy theory surrounding something called the Mud Flood and the Tartarian Empire. And this is a topic that I only learned about in the last year or so, and I've been wanting to cover it in some capacity ever since, just because it's like really interesting. And it's this wild story full of twists and turns, and it makes you kind of question the official narrative of history to some extent. I was originally hoping to get this out last week, of course. But with how complex this theory is and with everything else going on, having limited time in my schedule to research and take notes and all that, I needed one more week to get this thing into a cohesive thought. So thanks for your patience. Now sit back and relax, grab a snack, or, do whatever you're doing if you like to listen to podcasts while you work, and join me as I present to you the theory of the mud flood and Tartaria. All right, so this one is like the mother of all rabbit holes. And apologies if you can hear a lawnmower in the background. My neighbor is just like grinding up grass right now. So anyway, I'm going to try to outline things here, and hopefully in the end, it all kind of makes some sort of sense within the structure of the theory. So what is, or what was, Tartaria and the mud flood? Well, starting around 2016 or so, these ideas really started kind of making the rounds on the internet and trending on Google. And Tartaria, at a glance, was this supposed massive, technologically advanced empire, which some say was greater than the British or the Roman empires throughout history. It had its own flags, extravagant architecture, that a horse and buggy civilization, allegedly, according to people who suggest this theory, shouldn't have been able to make, and culture that spanned Eurasia and maybe even into North America as well. And all of this, of course, predated our modern civilization. And the word is that they held this global influence along with other major world powers at the time. And there's even this like graphic that shows, it's not even a graphic, it's an old illustration from this historical book that supposedly shows this lineage of emperors and kings of Tartaria. And it seems like the existence of this empire was known as, information about it used to appear in like the Encyclopedia Britannica up until the late 1700s or so, until it just kind of vanished without explanation. And the theory is that Tartaria was decimated by this great reset type of event that wiped the whole thing out by a series of natural disasters and cataclysms, potentially war with other powers around the world, in as little as 150 to 200 years ago. So, and afterwards, any traces left of this civilization were supposedly covered up, and it was written out of the history books. Anything that was left over, buildings and that kind of thing, technology was destroyed or refabbed. Technology was reverse engineered, and then it would be claimed to be like a new invention. So that's like the brief overview of what people who support this theory are claiming. And basically it falls into the realm of lost and forgotten or covered up history. And I want to preface this episode by saying that, based on what I know about history, I've always enjoyed reading about history. I'm inclined to think that this is not really true. There's a lot of pretty outlandish claims and stuff like that you'll hear about, and it's, historians consider this to be pseudo history, and probably for good reason. Just because there's so much historical evidence and documentation that contradicts all of these claims, made by, I guess we'll call them Tartarian truthers. But there's this popular saying with mythos like this that history is written by the victors. And perhaps there might be a kernel of truth to this story. So where is this all coming from? Well, it kind of seems like it started with people looking at old maps of the world. And old maps are really interesting. I love looking at old maps. Sometimes there's these old maps that show land masses that don't exist anymore, not like related to Atlantis or anything, but in the Atlantic Ocean, kind of near Iceland, there was this island that was called Friesland that appeared for a while that wasn't actually there, or maybe it still is. I don't know. And it's just secret and covered up. It also makes me think of like High Brazil, which I talked about on a previous episode once. And there was also, people used to think that California was actually an island. And there's some weird stuff about that too. Because, the idea is that like, oh, cartographers just made a mistake. And they thought that the Gulf of California beyond the Baja Peninsula just kept going and going up until like the Alaskan coast or something like that. And they just made a mistake. But there's also on these maps that show the island of California, there's these 4 islands in the channel that correlate to some of the tallest mountain peaks in California currently. And then there's also San Francisco is on the map, but it's in the bay that's in the channel. And then there's California Island, but it doesn't line up to where San Francisco is today. So that's really kind of weird and interesting. And you'd think that cartographers would be a little bit more accurate with their mapping. But obviously, a lot of these old world maps look kind of odd and strange. Their technique wasn't as good as what we have today. Obviously, we also have satellites and that kind of thing that can very, very precisely map the surface of the planet that we live on. So, I think a lot of this idea comes from these old maps. And in Asia, on some of these old maps, they depicted this large area in Central Asia that had these borders that would kind of ebb and flow. They'd grow and shrink, and it was usually labeled as Tartaria, or Grand Tartaria. And this name dates back to about 13th century Western Europe, and officially on the books, it's this blanket term used in cartography to describe vast and unexplored wild regions of the world, and particularly in Asia, like the Asian steppes. And this area was encompassed by the Caspian Sea to the west, along with the Ural Mountains that divide Europe and Asia. And to the east would be the Pacific Ocean. And before that, Tartary seems to stem from the ancient Greek word of Tartarus, which meant the underworld. In the ancient Greek polytheistic religion. So it could be interpreted as meaning something that's buried beneath us, perhaps something like a forgotten civilization. But according to the official narrative, Tartaria was described as this place that was beyond the northern borders of China, India, and Persia, modern day Iran. And it was essentially Central Asia, this very large and mostly uninhabited, unexplored wilderness. And according to history, after the fall of Genghis Khan's Mongolian Empire, which it didn't end with him, of course, it broke into different kingdoms and all that that fragmented. And by the late 1300s, all these different kingdoms kind of assimilated into other major cultures of the time, and those who didn't maintain a kind of nomadic lifestyle on the Asian steppes, which is now primarily modern day Russia and Mongolia, of course. Yeah, I don't know. It's just a really simplified overview of that. I could probably do a whole podcast series about that piece of history, but I'm just trying to keep it brief because there's so much stuff to get into still. Anyway, these people who lived in this vast expanse of Central and Northern Asia were once referred to as the Tatars or Tartars, which is the name that's mainly designated for Turkic-speaking peoples, which may be why the name Tartary and Tartaria shows up on old maps, in addition to it being the name meaning like unexplored lands. So officially, that's kind of like what the story is. But beyond that, we have this little theory floating out there. It's not really a little theory. It's a pretty big theory that instead, this Tartaria that shows up on all these old maps, beyond being a wilderness with remnants of the Mongolian Empire, that it was actually the birthplace of this erased and forgotten, highly advanced civilization. But where's the evidence, you ask? Well, I'm going to tell you, there are a number of facets and sub-theories to this overall grand unifying theory of Tartaria. So I'm going to throw everything and the kitchen sink at you and go over all the parts of this theory that I could find in the time that I had available to me. So I feel like my brain may have melted a little bit trying to make this all make sense. So I'm stoked to have a vacation, to have a break. So get ready. Here we go. All right. The first thing that I'm going to talk about here, which is one of the more popular parts of the theory among the mud flood and Tartaria crowd, is this so-called evidence and the existence of these defensive structures that are found all over the world called star forts. And they were primarily built between the 16th and 19th centuries. And there's some people who dedicate tons of time to studying just this one part of the theory. And some of these places are relatively small. Others were entire cities, like built out of these geometrically precise structures that altered the very landscape that they were built upon. Thinking of my own corner of the world, nearby in New York, there's Fort Ticonderoga, which is effectively a star fort. There's also one in Crown Point near the Lake Champlain crossing. There's also one in the town of Lake George. And of course, the history of those is that they were built in the 1700s and used during the French and Indian Wars, as well as the Revolutionary War. Seemed to be a kind of popular way of building a fortified structure against aggressors. And the claim here is that because star fort structures are found everywhere around the world and are all very similar in the way that they're built, is that they must have been built by the same world-spanning civilization. This is sometimes called the Star Civilization, which is kind of thought to also be Tartaria. So perhaps some of these forts are older than the official history behind them and were abandoned and repurposed by survivors after whatever the Great Reset was that happened that took down Tartaria. And there's a bunch of different types of star forts with, different functionalities. And I'm going to link pictures of these forts in the show notes, as always, just so you can see what they look like. A lot of them literally look like 5-pointed stars. And yeah, this episode needs a lot of visual aid. I might make some YouTube videos about this eventually, but for our whole deep dive, I'd probably be working on that episode for about 6 months, and I don't want to keep you all waiting longer than you have to. So here's the rundown. There are 4-point star forts that are found in places like Europe. A good example is a structure called Holic. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, which is found in Slovakia. There's 5-point star forts, like I mentioned before. They just look like a regular old star. There's one called Castellet in Copenhagen, in Denmark. There's also long and thin star forts they're called long thinnies, which is real clever, I think. And there's a lot of those that are in France. There's also star cities, or star hubs as they're referred to, which can have anywhere from 6 to 12 like star points around them. And an example of one of those is in Palmanova in Italy. And there's a lot of geometry to these structures, which is really interesting. So definitely check out the pictures I'm going to link. There's also star hedgehogs, which is a combination of a 4 to 5 point star fort. And it also includes, it's attached to a star city, which is like a city that's walled off with this kind of like pointy defensive structure. And then there's also the star megalopolis, which an example of that would be Floriana in Malta, which is essentially this large metropolitan area that incorporates the pointy style of the star forts and cities, but just on a larger scale. So some think that like the star points on these places might connect with like the Earth energy grid, which harnessed power for Tartarian cities. And, it's all alleged, of course. But we'll talk about the free energy portion a little bit later. It's also interesting that several of these star forts are built in geographically challenging locations, which causes Tartarian truthers out there to question how they were built in the first place without modern technology and know-how. I mean, there's a lot of ancient stuff built on top of mountains with sheer cliff faces in places like India and Southeast Asia. Even Machu Picchu in Peru is, I would consider, an engineering marvel. And I always scratch my head because it's like, how did they build that? And a lot of these civilizations that built them didn't have like wheels or pulleys. Sometimes they didn't even have beasts of burden to help out with moving stones and just like refacing geography. And I'm not saying it was ancient aliens, which, a lot of people attribute that kind of stuff to ancient aliens, but this is not that, I don't think. And also, I've never been to the Statue of Liberty, but did you know that it rests on a structure called Fort Wood? And it happens to be a frickin' star fort. It's probably just coincidence, but I don't know, guys. And another detail about these things is that they usually have accompanying and auxiliary structures that go along with them, which were, of course, built in the same style with lots of points and angles. And there's stuff like canal systems and these like man-made geometric islands with moats dug around them, not too dissimilar to a medieval castle. You can find a lot more info about this kind of stuff over on this website called starciv.org. And if you also Google, there's a star fort like map overlay on Google Earth that you can download from this site, where someone has gone through like, I don't know how many hours of mapping out hundreds, maybe even thousands of star forts around the world, and also like potential star forts and their accompanying structures. Sometimes you can see on Google Maps, Google Earth, really old structures. It's just basically like the only thing that's left is like the foundation and how it perturbs like the ground. So you can still see like the shape of it. It's pretty wild because literally these things are found in every corner of the planet. Some are really, really old, like especially in places like Central Asia, where you'd expect to see a lot more star forts, although there's not really all that many on this particular map that have been found, or like the Caspian Sea area that are just like overgrown. You can barely see the foundations of them. It would be really cool if like a LiDAR scan was done on this kind of stuff, kind of how research groups are revealing previously unknown Mayan cities in the Yucatan and Central America in recent years. And on this map, it's mostly, I would say the majority of the star forts on this map are like in Europe. There's a lot in North America, some in Africa, some in India, Southeast Asia, and there's even a few in South America. And yeah, it's funny. It's just like the bulk of them are in Europe, which it makes me wonder, like, if this is connected to Tartaria, this civilization that was supposed to like have its hub in Central Asia. Why are there not more in that area? I think realistically, it's probably stuff that was built in the Renaissance to Age of Enlightenment as part of like history that we do know. And star forts, I should have mentioned at the beginning, they're also called bastion forts, which were like, these forts were on the books. They're supposed to be these fortifications that were built like in tandem with the development and use of gunpowder and explosives in the battlefield sometime in like the late 1400s. And the polygonal design with its star points or outcroppings were supposed to eliminate like blind spots that an attacking army could use to their advantage. So looking at star forts under that context of the official historical record or narrative does make sense. And, either way you put it, they're an engineering marvel for their day. And they're also really cool to look at. But, maybe, just maybe, there's a connection to Tartaria or some long forgotten or covered up global civilization. But I think it's far more believable that this was a natural progression from a medieval style castle or something like that that evolved along with the advent of new kinds of weaponry like guns and cannons and that kind of thing. All right, so the next piece I'm going to talk about is the architecture component of the theory and building styles that span continents and cultures seemingly hundreds of years apart. And this theory claims that they must have been connected to the same civilization. Many who subscribe to the theory of Tartaria and the mud flood point out that the beaux-arts style, it's French, it's spelled B-E-A-U-X-A-R, well, there's a dash, ARTS, and the Second Empire styles of architecture, which became popular during the late 19th and early 20th century. Beaux-arts evolved from the French during their neoclassical period after the French Revolution, and Second Empire kind of came out of the Napoleonic area, especially after Napoleon III, who was the first president of France in like the mid 1800s. This is after like Napoleon, who like decided to wage war on all of Europe, and then he got kicked off to was it Corsica? I can't remember what island it was. And then he came back and then he got kicked out again. So these styles drew inspiration and elements from Renaissance and Baroque style architecture. So in a nutshell, it's stuff that's highly ornate. And the United States was heavily influenced by this style from the mid 1800s up until the early 20th century. And basically, the style could be described as having lots of arches, grand entrances, and staircases. There's a lot of symmetry, flat roofs, lots and lots of minutia and elegant details, among other characteristics. I won't bore you with more details than that, but a lot of these grand entrances to these buildings built with this style have these massive tall doors, which have led some Tartarian truthers to claim that the Tartarians might have actually been giants. And if you haven't listened to my 2-part episode about ancient giants, definitely check it out, because some of that could potentially play a role with this theory. Kind of interesting. Now, some of the most well-known buildings in this style, I'll just list a few. There's the Palais Garnier in Paris, which is an opera house that was officially constructed between 1861 and 1875. There's the Old Singer Building, which was once the tallest building in Manhattan. It was built in 1908 and demolished in 1967. And as we dive into this theory further, we'll be finding out that demolition of old buildings plays a big role in this theory. Another was the City Hall in San Francisco, which was built between 1913 and 1916 after the 1906 earthquake that leveled the city, which is interesting considering the cataclysm aspect of this whole theory. And the New York Public Library in Manhattan is also considered to be built in this beaux-arts style between 1897 and 1911. And there's also New York's Grand Central Terminal. Washington, D.C.'s Thomas Jefferson Building is another one that's high on the list. And this kind of architecture can be found all over the world. South America, Africa, East Asia, Australia, Europe, of course, beyond just France. Its popularity really spanned the globe. Now, there's a number of historical buildings that have been demolished throughout the 20th century in the Beaux-Arts style that believers in this theory point to as evidence supporting it, like there was a cover-up. And there's one of the buildings was the Waldorf Astoria that's pointed to for this cover-up that was built in 1893, and it was once considered the fanciest luxury hotel in the entire world. It was sold only a couple decades later in 1929, and immediately, maybe not immediately, but shortly after, it was demolished to make room for the Empire State Building, which was built in the 1930s. There's also New York City's City Hall Post Office on Broadway, which was built in the Second Empire style, which was raised in 1939 to expand City Hall Park. The original Penn Station was destroyed in the mid to late 1960s and was replaced with Madison Square Garden. And there's also several other examples of buildings like this that are being demolished everywhere between America, Europe, and Asia. And I think you could chalk this up to some of them, they were built poorly, constructed poorly in the first place, or whoever buys the property wants to do something else with that property, even if they're, paving a parking lot. That's their business, I suppose. But it's interesting in the context of this theory that this Tartarian empire was wiped out sometime in the 1800s, and they have all this grand architecture that's left over. Some of it's been repurposed, and part of the generational erasing of it is to destroy the last vestiges of this empire through its art and architecture. Some people say that other great constructions of humanity, like the Great Wall of China, was actually built by the Tartarians to keep the Chinese out, versus our understanding that China built the wall to keep the Mongolians out. That is if the Tartarians were the Mongolians as part of the theory. Who knows? Another architectural component to this theory is that people point out they associate aqueducts a lot with this theory. And of course, aqueducts are found all over Europe. They're mainly associated with being constructed by Rome. The Minoan civilization may have invented them first, about 2000 BCE, so like 4,000 years ago, because they had pretty advanced irrigation and watering systems for the time. But some of these are grand in their design. They seem really old, and some apparently have no record of them being built. So it's thought that they came from Tartaria. It's probably more like just bad record keeping. But one of the big ones that gets pointed out is that there's this Roman style aqueduct that's found in Mexico City called the Querétaro Aqueduct. Not sure if I pronounced that right. Apologies if I did. Which was officially built in the late 1700s, but people often attribute this and other similar constructions to being, let's say, suspiciously Tartarian. But, I think there's some reasonable documentation for that aqueduct to say that it wasn't built by someone other than Mexico at the time. Now, speaking of demolished buildings and intricate architecture, so one of the biggest aspects of this theory that people believe support the idea of this covered up great civilization is the World's Fair. But why? But why? I guess before going into that, if people don't know, I'm just going to give a brief explanation of what the World's Fair is. Essentially, these were these large international exhibitions that were designed to show off the achievements and progress of the world's many nations. Like, how far has humanity come? And these events began in London in 1851, and since then, major cities all around the world have hosted these events, like Paris, Vienna, Philadelphia, Barcelona, Melbourne, Chicago, St. Louis, Brussels, San Francisco, and the list goes on and on. Between 1851 and up until about World War II, these events were held on a regular schedule, like every 2 to 3 years. Sometimes there were longer periods that they didn't happen, like 8 to 10 years. And since the 90s, they've been on more of a 5 to 6 year interval. And they still happen to this day. I don't think they're as grand in scope as they used to be, but they still actually happen. The next one's actually going to be in Osaka, Japan in 2025. But yeah, they're just a little different today than they were back in the 1800s. And all of the world's fairs have their own unique themes too. For example, the next one is going to be designing future society for our lives, and going back in time. For example, the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904 was kind of celebrating, or it was like a retrospective of the Louisiana Purchase. The 1893 Chicago World's Fair was about the discovery of America, which is also, I think, the World Fair. The Chicago one is the one that this theory points to a lot as like the example. The very first one was about the industry of all nations, or, like the Industrial Revolution, of course, in like the mid 1800s, right? So they kind of seem to mirror what's going on with humanity at the time, which makes sense, I think. Now, how this relates to Tartaria and the mud flood, believers of the theory think that the initial World's Fairs in the 1800s were some of the last remnants of the Tartarian Empire. These events were grandiose and extravagant in scale, with millions of people attending them, with exhibitors and vendors showing off cutting-edge new technology and culture and all this stuff. There's also this part about how many of these World's Fairs had entire areas constructed with contemporary buildings, almost like a mini city built over hundreds of acres in this short period of time, like a year. And then after the World's Fair happened, they would be demolished, or sometimes they would get burned to the ground. I'm not clear on whether or not ones that got burned down were on purpose or on accident. Some compared these massive undertakings and their official explanation, like how Egyptologists say that the Great Pyramid was built in only 25 years, but it's made out of 2.5 million limestone blocks that are several tons each, without the use of the wheel. And if I did the math right, that works out to one block being put into place very precisely about every 5 minutes, which is, kind of wild. But obviously the buildings of the World's Fair and the pyramids, so there's, pyramids are far more complex than what was at the World's Fair, as far as how they were built and how long that took. But these places also have had these electrical grids, these early electrical grids that would light them up at night, with working water, of course. The very first World's Fair in London wound up having more than 6 million visitors over the course of just 6 months, which was a third of the population of the entirety of Britain at the time. And there was this massive structure that was created at this World's Fair that was called the Crystal Palace Exhibition, which was dismantled after and then put back together in another spot in London, and then subsequently burned down in 1936, which a lot of like the Tartarian truthers are like, that's suspicious. Why did that burn down? It could have been an accident. I'm not sure. But because of all these fairs being dismantled or destroyed in one way or another, this theory suggests that it's this erasure of Tartaria. Like these World's Fairs buildings were actually part of Tartarian cities, and then the new civilization came in and started using them, and then as a way to kind of erase knowledge of this previous civilization, they got burned down or changed up a bit. But the problem with this idea is that a lot of these seemingly ornate buildings were built to look like old world architecture, and we have on record that these places were built with like cheap material and mostly out of wood, so they could be taken apart, dismantled with relative ease, and discarded afterwards, because the World's Fair is just kind of like renting an area to set up. It's like any old carnival coming to town, and they're not going to just leave all of their rides and their trash there after the event's over. So because the material's cheap, I think something like that could be easily flammable. It could catch fire and just be disintegrated. And as it turns out, there's only a handful of buildings over the 70 years of World's Fairs that were actually built to be permanent structures, like Chicago's Field Museum, which was actually one of the structures built for the Chicago World's Fair. Now, let's talk about the mud flood. This is supposed to be this apocalyptic event that brought an end to the Tartarian Empire. This whole idea of a mud flood stems from the belief that old architecture from the 1800s and earlier shows signs of this worldwide mud flood type event that buried Tartarian cities under several feet of mud and earth, like an entire building story or more, 8 to 12 feet. However, what caused this supposed mud flood remains unclear, and nobody can seem to really agree if it was a global event all at the same time or a series of smaller events over the course of a few years. Some have suggested that mud volcanoes, regular volcanoes, earthquakes that were so violent could have caused the ground to undergo a process called liquefaction. So instead of flooding the streets with mud that's coming from some unknown source, it actually like made the buildings sink into the ground. And we have modern day like video of this stuff happening. It is a natural like disaster type thing that happens sometimes, but on a global scale, I'm not sure that would happen. Who knows? But in the wake of this event, Tartarian truthers point to certain old architectural features from buildings made in the 17 and 1800s as evidence of a mud flood. Perhaps you've walked around your town or city and noticed ground level or basement windows in older buildings like churches, building blocks, apartment buildings, that kind of thing. And you might see these ground level windows, like literally just like a window, the top of a window archway, just peeking out above the level of the sidewalk. And it clearly goes underground from there. And it's an interesting idea and makes you wonder, like, is this evidence that this building was buried and like I'm standing on top of like the mud flood? Or was there, is there a more reasonable explanation? If you Google mud flood evidence, you'll get a lot of image results showing old black and white photos from 100 or more years ago of certain buildings in various places around the planet being dug up that show these buildings just keep going down and down further, 10, 20, 30 feet underground. And it's not clear if it's like this is the foundation or was the building actually buried, because some of these parts of these buildings that are underground, they have full-on windows and doors that are clearly above like a foundation level, but they're also underground. One interesting example is St. Mary Magdalene Church, where there's this old black and white photo of it being excavated, and it was buried under 25 to 30 feet of dirt. And it's not the foundation that's 25, 30 feet. There's like, a whole structure down there. It's kind of wild, but what would cause that? Would it be an actual mud flood? I don't know. Or was there another reason for it? Chattanooga, Tennessee is often cited as being a prime example of where you can find evidence of the mud flood, like these tops of arched windows that are at sidewalk level. There's even claims that this city and others in America were already there when European settlers arrived. Like people were moving westward through North America, and they found these cities totally constructed but completely abandoned. So they just moved in, set up shop, built new roads on top of the sediment from the mud flood, and rebooted civilization. Although the official explanation for what's found in Chattanooga is that the underground architecture that you can find there was a result of citizens' efforts to prevent river flooding in the city after this big flood wrecked the place in 1867. So yeah, like Chattanooga's got this whole like underground that's going on there that you can like go into. And a lot of this was seemingly forgotten and then rediscovered in the 1970s. Another place is Leavenworth, Kansas, which has this large 200-year-old underground city portion. And apparently nobody knows who built it and why. There's also the Ybor City neighborhood in Tampa, Florida, that has this underground city component to it that's a complete mystery as well. Yeah, it's kind of funny, you know, like just thinking about this kind of stuff that's just like just under our feet. And at a first glance, you're like, well, maybe there's something to this theory after all. But I think that this idea doesn't take into consideration that for centuries, humans have just built layer upon layer over previous and older buildings and over older civilizations. I mean, you can look at something like the catacombs in Paris or the old subway tunnels in New York City. They're just layered like an onion. I mean, there's places in Europe. There's that example of like Darren Kuyu in Turkey, where a guy was like remodeling his home and like broke down a wall and found this tunnel into this old mega ancient underground city that people lived in. And that's a whole other mystery, which is really interesting. You know, like street levels can and are sometimes raised up in certain circumstances, potentially to mitigate risk from flooding from natural waterways. And, you know, everything is on the original ground level still and either gets turned into a basement or is just sealed off. So you have this original first floor that's buried, and then below that, there's the original basement and foundation in a lot of cases. And here's something to consider in regards to this part of the theory based on my own personal experience. The last time that I went to Seattle, I actually went on a tour of the Seattle Underground. And this was well before I ever heard of Tartaria and the mud flood. But basically, the tour has certain access points in the city where you can go underground. And there's still like old storefronts that are buried 10 to 20 feet under street level, which is really wild. It's kind of it's a haunting experience. And the reason why this stuff is still there wasn't because of a mud flood per se. Seattle was actually mostly burned to the ground in a fire in 1889. And I know fire, burning, destruction, Tartaria, right? But the city rebuilt on top of the ruins of the original Seattle, which was also built on tide flats from the Puget Sound, which were constantly flooding and turning the streets into this muddy mess. There's this funny part about how the toilets that they used back then, and I can't remember if it was like they were calling them crappers or what, but they had this like really like they had to put the water tank on it like several feet above the actual like toilet because of the water pressure from the tide coming in and out. And if it wasn't high enough, water would just like start spraying out of the toilet. So it was a big problem for people who lived in Seattle, and they had to essentially raise the entire city up a level. Like there's old pictures of them raising the streets up an entire building story level and paving everything over. So it's just a really interesting piece of history. You know, you've got these retaining walls that are 8 to 12 feet underground, and to help out with the issue of water flooding. And that's why there's this Seattle Underground. It's a weird little piece of history. And if you're ever out in Seattle, definitely check it out. I'm not sure if Chattanooga does tours of their underground. I'm going to have to look into that. But yeah, I know people that support this theory would probably just say it's all part of the cover up. And of course there's a fire that burned down old Tartarian architecture that was there before, but most of the buildings in Seattle at that time weren't really grandiose structures. I mean, mid 1800s, people were just getting out to that part of North America. And in fact, you know, most were just wooden houses, maybe some larger municipal buildings, but it wasn't until after the Great Fire of 1889 that buildings started to be required to be made out of brick and stone masonry. So there would be less of a chance of the entire city getting leveled, right? So this leads to the next talking point, which is empty cities. And like I mentioned just a little while ago about reading about settlers stumbling upon an empty Chattanooga and other cities across the continent, this part of the theory points out that there's these old photographs from like the mid 1800s and onwards of all of these like grand cities where there's nobody present. Like they were built kind of like these empty cities that developers in China are building and nobody moves in. But we're talking like places like London, New York City, Paris, and so on, major economic and cultural centers of the world. So it's like these old 1800s cities were basically like ghost towns. There's nobody on the streets, no horse and buggy action, no commerce going on or anything like that. So the question is, where are all the people? If these were massive metropolis type places, surely there would be people out and about any time of the day in a city. I mean, you know, New York is the city that never sleeps. I'm not sure if New York is technically included on this list of like found abandoned cities. But you know, just for an example, you know, I think this part of the theory is definitely one of the more far-fetched aspects of it. I mean, the whole thing is, you know, it can be easily explained by, you know, saying that this picture was taken in the early hours of the morning, so nobody was out, people were still sleeping, or these pictures could be taken using like a long exposure, meaning you leave the shutter open, so if anyone walks into the frame, if only for a few seconds, and the shutter is open for, say, several minutes, the person's not really going to show up. There might be like a slight blur, but the longer exposure, I think it's less likely you'd find traces of people, you know, depending on the time of day, of course. And, you know, it also could be just like a perfectly timed shot where everything that was moving in the frame finally gets out of the frame and there's nothing there. But even some of the pictures that are claimed to be these empty cities, like sometimes you can see like a person off in the distance. So I don't know. It's like, then again, if it's a bustling city, there should be some traces of human activity. So, you know, maybe it's combination of early in the morning or long exposure. I'm just spitballing here. And of course, these old photos are in black and white, so it's hard to tell whether it's dawn or the middle of the day or just before night, or if it's cloudy even. On the flip side, of course, there are, of course, like I mentioned, plenty of photos from the 1800s that do show people in cities, and videos, early films that show people driving horse and buggy or early automobiles in city streets and stuff like that. So this part of the theory, I don't think holds much water at all. All right, a couple more points here that I want to make, and here's the fun one as to why people think that the Tartarian Empire is being covered up, and it has to do with free energy. Now, if you ask anyone who has read anything about this theory, is that the Tartarians had knowledge and mastery of the use of electricity. And not only that, this ability to harness electricity gave them power, of course, for their civilization, and gave rise to the development of high-tech machinery and everything that comes along with that. Now, I've seen people posting about how Tartarians had robots or these motorized single-wheeled bikes called monowheels that South Park made fun of once. I mean, those were invented in the 1920s, which is well after the supposed collapse and cover-up of Tartaria, but it's kind of an out there invention that people throw in, this whole idea. All right. So where is Tartaria getting their energy from? Clearly, if there was a previous technologically advanced civilization that was using power, we would think that we could find traces or evidence of mining of like fossil fuels and that kind of thing. But the theory states that the Tartarian Empire was able to harness free energy from the ether or from Earth's atmosphere and the Earth itself. Many point to old pictures of buildings that are built in the beaux-arts style and Second Empire style that have steeples and large spires with metal rods attached to them, even obelisks like the ones that are in Washington, the Washington Monument, or in London, in the Vatican, and Egypt. Even tall storage or lookout towers were theorized to be part of this old world electrical grid. Clearly, these spire-like structures are either topped with lightning rods or weather vanes, or other towers were used for lookout or storage purposes, right? So the idea is that these antenna, as they're claiming, were gathering free energy and functioning as kind of like power plants. Now, this also kind of ties into the theory of the Great Pyramid of Giza being a massive free energy power plant. And an interesting thing to note is that there are actually old patents from the 1900s, the early 1900s, that some people have dug up that appear to show plans for free energy devices, or places like churches with their large steeples that could potentially be used to capture this kind of universal force to provide power to the world. And of course, you know, this is the same time period that Nikola Tesla lived in, and one of the big things with him was trying to figure out how to wirelessly transfer free energy around the world. And he was on his way to working on this idea and trying to find a solution to it with Wardenclyffe Tower, which is basically a Tesla coil on steroids that would draw energy from the atmosphere as well as from the Earth itself. But of course, ultimately, he lost funding and the tower was dismantled. So Nikola Tesla is a whole topic that I think probably deserves its own episode. So yeah, maybe I'll do that at some point in the future. Let me know if you want to hear more about Tesla for sure. One thing I stumbled upon when researching this whole thing was the idea of natural nuclear reactors as a potential power source for Tartaria. So in Africa, in the country of Gabon, there is this site called the Oklo uranium mine. And in the early 70s, French scientists were testing uranium samples taken from there and found that there was a much lower amount of usable uranium than they initially thought. It looked like there was enough uranium 235 missing from these samples to make 6 nuclear bombs, which is kind of crazy. So, but it wasn't material that was stolen from the mine or anything. They realized that this like 200 kilos worth of uranium had been missing already for 2 billion years. And what they had stumbled upon was an ancient nuclear reactor that was like all natural. Like, how does that work? And as it turns out, this kind of thing was only theoretical up until the point that this was discovered. And the only way it can happen is if some very, very specific environmental conditions were met. And lo and behold, the Oklo mine actually had the very conditions needed for this to work, which involved enough uranium, enough neutrons hanging out from decayed uranium, which would start a chain reaction of energy, and then natural groundwater, which there was plenty of in that mine, which would flow in and control the reaction and keep it going. Eventually that water would evaporate and then the reaction would slow down. Maybe I'm getting that backwards. Either way, it was like this natural process where like the groundwater would come back and help maintain and balance out the reaction that was happening. And it was said that this reaction would put out about 100 kilowatts of energy per hour. And this reaction was going on for hundreds of thousands of years until it eventually used up too much of the uranium deposit to maintain the reaction. And I think officially this is the only known natural nuclear reactor, but allegedly there are about 16 or so in Gabon, and allegedly several others around the world. And of course, why this is important to the Tartaria theory is that these could have been like a potential source of power somehow if these reactions were still going and there was a way to somehow harness the energy, the steam to like maybe get something to like a magnet to spin to cause to generate electricity, an electromagnet. Jeez. But you know, this would all have to happen without Tartarian scientists having their faces melted off by the radiation, right? They'd have to have like, you know, special suits and stuff and structures that would have to be built, which I don't think there's any evidence of. But it is, it's interesting to think about in the context of the theory. But, you know, I suppose the big problem with this theory is that this mine, the nuclear reaction that was happening there, stopped 2 billion years ago. So, you know, can't really use that in the 1800s, right? It is an interesting thought, but I don't think it adds up unless there's more of these things out there currently happening and being harnessed. But I don't think there are anymore, at least. But that is kind of a cool piece of history to know that, you know, it is possible that there could be a natural nuclear reactor happening in the world. But as far as one of the reasons for Tartaria being covered up was, of course, the free energy, right? The competing Western civilization that we're a part of, which the Tartarian truthers, blame the cover up on is like the elite class of people, the powers that be, the bankers, the multinational corporations and such discovered massive fossil fuel deposits in the 1800s, like oil and gas and coal and all that, and began exploiting it and creating the world's first oil tycoons, the petrodollar, all that, that other rabbit hole that's, we're not going to go there today, but they wanted to corner the energy market, right, and make it so that the only way people could get electric power was through them and them alone. And if people wanted power, they of course had to pay up. And I think that's as far as what I've talked about, so far, that there could be some credence to this part of the theory as to why a civilization with free energy was covered up, that got taken out somehow. For example, there in the early 20th century, there were actually electric cars that people used to drive. I think it was probably too expensive to build them and maintain them at the time. I mean, hell, electric cars today, EVs, are still ridiculously expensive. But, once the combustion engine took over, electric cars weren't largely considered again for mass production and mass use until, the recent past 2 decades or so, over concerns of like stuff like peak oil and climate change and that kind of stuff. So, that's that's the free energy portion of the theory. It's pretty interesting for sure. Now another puzzle piece, and this is we're gonna do two more things here because we're past the hour right now. The next puzzle piece that people claim are like the receipts of like this being a real thing is this document from the CIA from 1957 that was declassified in 1998. And, I think this is an example of like cherry picking something without the context of the rest of the document. And keep in mind, this is the 1950s. So the Soviet Union was at its height and the world was well into Cold War and under threat of nuclear annihilation at like any minute. So I'm just going to read verbatim what the document states. All right. Or let us take the matter of history, which, along with religion, language, and literature, constitute the core of a people's cultural heritage. Here again, the communists have interfered in a shameless manner. For example, on the 9th of August, 1944, the Central Committee of the Communist Party, sitting in Moscow, issued a directive ordering the party's Tartar Provincial Committee to, quote, proceed to a scientific revision of the history of Tartaria, to liquidate serious shortcomings and mistakes of a nationalistic character committed by individual writers and historians in dealing with Tartar history. In other words, Tartar history was to be rewritten. Let us be frank, was to be falsified in order to eliminate references to Great Russian aggressions and to hide the facts of the real course of Tartar-Russian relations. And this was no isolated case. In every Muslim area within the USSR, historians and on orders of the Communist Party have rewritten history to distort facts so that the Russians appear always in a good light. Needless to say, histories which present the facts truthfully have been withdrawn and destroyed, so that the present and future generations of Muslims are forever denied a chance of learning the true facts of their nation's past. So a lot of people consider this as like a smoking gun, proving this theory, but again, it's kind of sort of cherry picking this quote without the context for the rest of the declassified document. The document is actually talking about the Soviet Union's dealings and subjugation of Muslim people throughout the Asian portion of the Soviet Union, like out to Kazakhstan and Siberia. It's less to do with covering up and erasing some grand prior unified global super civilization like Tartaria supposedly was, and more to do with Soviet imperialism enforcing communism on all of these people who live in Central and Northern Asia. And I can see how, like, this quote is like, oh, there was this big cover up and Russia's behind it. Like, they're the ones who erased Tartaria somehow. So yeah, I just think that quote is really kind of just, it's cherry picking without kind of putting into context the rest of what the document was saying. Now, the last little piece here that I'm going to mention is it's a little bit of a dark element of it, a little bit of a bummer, but we're just going to end on a bummer note. So throughout the 1800s and early 1900s, as many of us know, there were a lot of asylums built across America for the mentally ill. And part of the theory that includes this aspect claims that these asylums were used to section off people who survived the mud flood and the cataclysm that brought an end to the Tartarian Empire. People who remembered the old world, they say, would be thrown into these institutions and branded as insane or in need of some kind of psychological re-education to be a part of the New World society. Sounds kind of Orwellian, right? And then there's also talk of orphan trains, which back in the 1800s, there was this whole thing going on where 250,000 children who were all orphaned were shipped out from the East Coast of America and westward to various cities between 1850 and like 1930 or so. And this was actually like the start of the foster care system in the United States. And this is a real thing. Like, look it up. I didn't know about this until I was looking into Tartaria. And this, the explanation is that many of these children were from new immigrants that came to the U.S., or were from poor and destitute or families that abused them. And unfortunately, there were no safeguards in place back then for the safety and well-being of these kids. And many of them wound up being used for slave labor on farms, or the caretakers that they were brought to neglected or just abused them too. And by the time 1929 rolled around, there was a decreased need for farm labor due to the invention of certain technologies that helped make things easier for farmers, especially in the Midwest. So this train program, the orphan trains, ended. I gotta wonder if the Dust Bowl might also factor into that somehow. Not an avenue I looked into, but just a random thought. But, you know, how this fits into the Tartarian theory is that the idea that these 200 to 250,000 kids might have been orphaned when their parents died in the mud flood. And afterwards, when people started picking up the pieces to rebuild civilization, these kids were shipped out to repopulate the devastated cities throughout North America. And according to the theory, it would be a perfect way to erase the memory of Tartaria with these orphaned survivors, because these children wouldn't have much, if any, prior knowledge of Tartaria. And of course, any like non-Tartarian adult wouldn't be bringing them up with knowledge about it if they were, you know, ordered to keep it under wraps. I mean, overall, that seems pretty out there, I think. Like, I can see how, from a conspiracy theory perspective, it can be made to make sense but who knows? I'm not sure 250,000 children shipped across country on a train over the course of 80 years would be able to repopulate the continent. And also that's like 3 to 4 generations right there. You'd think that if they were all Tartarian, that the amount of children should have all been shipped out within the first year or two, right? Otherwise, there would be generations still growing up with potential knowledge of their past. But maybe that's just all part of the conspiracy. There's so many facets to this one, and every time I checked out message boards, Reddit threads, or blogs to dig up more info on this thing, it's like there's not really a lot of cohesive stuff in one spot. I think there might be like a book or two, but I couldn't really get my hands on that, so I had to work with what I had. But yeah, it's like you keep looking into this theory and you keep falling down different rabbit holes. And that's the thing with this theory. I feel like I just covered the surface level of each section, and there's a lot of way more in-depth things about it that people who look into this theory have written about or looked into. And yeah, like some people put a lot of time and effort into this theory, but whether or not I believe in it, after looking into it, I still think it's more likely that this is just fantasy, as there's tons of historical records and accounts that I would think prove the opposite of what this theory is claiming. Like, it's a fantastical idea that's fun to think about, some lost high technology civilization. Who doesn't love the idea of like a free energy society, this apex utopia that was out there at some point in history? But I feel like if it was only wiped out less than 200 years ago, there'd be more concrete evidence of it. Who knows? I'm more inclined to believe that if there is a lost civilization from our history that was out there at some time, we'd be looking at something more connected to places like Göbekli Tepe, and that are possibly connected to something far older, like a progenitor type civilization like Atlantis. But yeah, anyway, I hope you enjoyed the ride with this one. I think we'll be taking a little break from conspiracy theories for a bit to let my brain get some rest. And now a quick word from our sponsor, me. But really, if you want to sponsor the Strangeology podcast, please reach out to me for business inquiries at strangeologist@gmail.com. That's STRANGEOLOGIST@gmail.com. Or you can hit up the contact form on my website, strangeology.com. I would love to work with you. And if you're looking for a way to support the show and my content creation, the best place to do so right now is to head on over to patreon.com/Strangeology. I've got 6 different tiers, all with increasingly awesome benefits for members. Members can get shoutouts, merch discounts, exclusive merch, early access to episodes, access to Strangeology Beyond, which is the members-only portion of the show. There's even a T-shirt of the month club where you get a new home state cryptid design on a T-shirt every month. And it's been a minute since I've done a big shout-out, but there's a number of new people who have signed up to the Patreon, so let's just shout out everybody. We've got Alex, Alyssa, Chad from Appalachian Huntsman, MetaZoo Games, Greg Morrill from All the Weird and Cryptocasters, Sean, Miranda, John, Marine, Prepared Wolf, Gail, Adam, Ryan, Cassie, Anne, Roxy, Angie, MG, Adam, Daniel from Blue Room Insight, Easton, Guy, Nolan, Megan, Jason, Jeff from Map in Black, and our newest addition, Craig. So thank you all for your continued support. It helps me out so much and helps keep the lights running here at Strangeology. And just one more time, if you want to check it out and lend some support, you can head on over to patreon.com/Strangeology. You can also support the show by heading over to strangeology.etsy.com. This is my one-stop shop for all things weird and Fortean. I've got a bunch of cryptid designs, UFO designs, and that kind of stuff that you can pick up on t-shirts and tank tops, or since colder weather is coming, at least in my part of the world, there's also long sleeves, sweatshirts, and hoodies available. I even have some pattern designs on fleece blankets, which is fun if you want to cozy up for the upcoming spooky season. I have also got stickers, posters, pins, my home state cryptid map, and of course, I'm always working on adding more and more items to the shop as time goes on. I even have a Tartaria design in the shop, if you've not noticed. So if you like cryptid gear and that kind of stuff, definitely check it out. Again, that's strangeology.etsy.com. And of course, listening to the show and sharing it with your family and friends is one of the biggest ways to support the show. It always helps out and means the world to me. Without you all out there tuning in and sharing the show, downloading it, I don't know what I'd be doing. And also, as always, make sure to follow me on all my socials, linked in the show notes, for more content, giveaways, and all that stuff. All right, I think that's all for me for now. I'm going to take a quick break here, and when I come back for Strangeology Beyond, I'm going to chat about another historical conspiracy theory that's called the Phantom Time Hypothesis. Patrons, stick with me, and for everyone else, until the next time, take care of yourselves and each other, and keep it strange. Hey everyone, welcome back to Strangeology Beyond, your members only portion of the show. This one's probably going to be a little bit shorter than usual just because of